Well, welcome back, and for the second half of our conference. Starting off this afternoon is a paper by Dr. Lisa Ossian, who's a professor of history at Des Moines Area Community College. She received her master's degree in women's studies from Eastern Michigan University and her doctorate from Iowa State University in agricultural history and rural studies. Author of 3 books, The Home Fronts of Iowa, 1930 to 1945, The Forgotten Generation, American Children in World War II, and The Depression Dilemmas of Rural Iowa, 1929 to 1933. Ossian has now directed her research interests in exploring Hoover's post-war food relief efforts. Her next book is tentatively titled The Grimmest Spectre, The World Famine Emergency, Herbert Hoover's Mission, and the Invisible Years, 1946 to 47. Ossian serves on the editorial board of the International Academic Journal, War and Culture, and as editor of a forthcoming volume, American Women and War, 1852 to 1945. Her talk today is entitled A Kind and Understanding Heart, The Politics of Friendship Between Harry Truman and Herbert Hoover, 1946 to 1964. Please welcome Lisa Ossian.
I changed my title a little bit, so anyway, and I do have slides. I have the after lunch crowd, so I'm hoping all of you didn't eat too much, okay, in that warm weather on that. What quality should a president possess? A reporter asked Eleanor Roosevelt in the spring of 1946, and she quickly responded, a kind and understanding heart. And perhaps this was the quality that Herbert Hoover and Harry Truman possessed throughout their friendship, which began in the spring of 1945, a little over 72 years ago. Hoover and Truman were, on paper and on the surface, very different men. Hoover was a Republican. He was the Depression-era president. He was an engineer. And he was also a humanitarian. Truman was a Democrat. He was the post-World War II president. He was a politician. And he also had been a captain in the First World War. But as the joint project of the Truman and Hoover Library so eloquently states in its introduction to their documentary history of this presidential friendship, it is easy to overlook the fact that they both had roots in farming communities. They had known economic hardship and self-reliance. They were transformed by the conflagration of World War I, and they lived in the shadow of Franklin D. Roosevelt. But I would also add that both men were in many ways quite similar in their hearts. Both were ethical men in their respective religions, one Hoover as a Quaker and Truman as a Baptist. Both were practical leaders who developed strong camaraderie and loyalty from their men. Men who worked with both Hoover and Truman were loyal to them forever. They were both loving husbands who stayed absolutely true to their first and only wives. Both fell in love once, and that was it. And I think Truman, too, had a respect for Hoover, being a recent widower when Lou had died in 1944. And they were also committed fathers who protected and nurtured their 2 sons or their daughter, and also their grandchildren. April 12th, 1945. This would be the first communication between the 31st and the 33rd president. Herbert Hoover sent a telegram offering condolences and assistance after the death of FDR. All Americans will wish you strength for your gigantic task. You have the right to call for any service in aid of the country. Signed, Herbert Hoover. Truman would respond a week later. Please accept my thanks for your message of the 12th. I need not assure you that your good wishes are deeply appreciated. Very sincerely yours, Harry S. Truman. And he would write in his handwritten note at the bottom, "I assure you I shall feel free to call upon you. Thanks for the offer." And Truman would say to his staff later on at the end of April that he was going to do something they were not going to like. He was going to invite Herbert Hoover to the White House. And so between handwritten letters and communication between their aides, letters and phone calls and that, the two presidents would arrange their very first meeting. And in my presentation, I'm going to quote a lot from these two, because to me, if you're going to look at a relationship between friends and that, words matter. The words matter. And the words that they used with each other were often very carefully chosen and very, very well mannered. And that would give them a very strong basis for their friendship. So on the morning of May 28th, 1945, this would end Herbert Hoover's 12-year isolation from the White House. A meeting in the Oval Office that would last 55 minutes, but create a friendship that would last until Hoover's death in 1964. Hoover was asked to write, and he loved to write memorandums, as you've heard from the other previous speakers, and it was several pages, but this was just a couple sentences. "I saw President Truman this morning at 10:30 a.m. He asked me to tell him what I thought of the whole food situation. I replied that the situation was degenerating all over the world, partly, of course, due to the war, and partly due to mismanagement, but that he had to take it as it is, and that there was no time to be bothered with recrimination as to what might have been. Bare subsistence meant hunger, and hunger meant communism." Those were Hoover's lines. Truman would always be very, very brief, kind of pithy. He had a 2-line memorandum versus 4 pages. And he would write, "Dear Hoover, thanks a lot for your memorandum. It will be very useful to me." And then he added a P.S. "I appreciated very much your coming to see me. It gave me a lift." And in his private writing, Truman would write the following: "Saw Herbert Hoover day before yesterday and had a pleasant and constructive conversation on food and the general troubles of U.S. presidents, 2 in particular. We discussed our prima donnas and what makes them, and some of my boys who came in with me are having trouble with their dignity and prerogatives. It's hell when a man gets in close association with the president." And I realized, too, Truman likes to use hell a lot, in his writings. And in his memoirs years later, some historians have faulted him for the exact details of this first meeting. But certainly Truman recorded the spirit of the occasion, the call, the respect, the urgency, the drama, and even the humor, as he noted that Hoover remembered the way to the Oval Office. So this would be their second meeting. Things were so complex at the end of May of 1945, and all of the decisions that needed to be made to end the war in the Pacific, and then the fall, and all of that. And so the two would not meet again until March 1st, 1946. And Hoover was interrupted in a fishing trip, so this is how seriously he took it. He dropped, the fishing in Florida and came immediately to the White House and agreed to serve as honorary chairman of the Famine Emergency Committee. Later that afternoon, Clinton Anderson, the new Secretary of Agriculture, and Henry A. Wallace, who was now Secretary of Commerce, would join them. And Truman would comment in his memoirs later about this joint meeting. "I told the group that I thought this was the most important meeting we had held in the White House since I had become president." And that's quite something, considering all of the major decisions Truman had to make following that. Hoover would also write about the event. "The inevitable aftermath of war is famine, and with famine, civilization itself is jeopardized. The last great reservoir from which starvation can be halted is the United States." And so he talked about this responsibility being thrust upon the American people. And Hoover would state very dramatically, "We cannot fail." And within hours and a couple of days, the entire trip would be planned. And Hoover was back. And if you'll notice in this picture, he's smiling. I think he could almost be skipping, okay, out of the White House in that. He was so thrilled, as we've noticed, to, one, to be called back to the White House, but also to be of use again, to be working, for a cause that he was really good at. And so he would make 2 radio addresses before the American public on March 14th and 16th, before the departure of this global famine survey. And he would note that 800 million people were at threat of starvation. More people are dying after World War II than during it. This is the crisis, situation. And Truman knew nobody knew more about food and about saving lives than Hoover. And he needed him. And so, as Hoover would say at the end of the radio addresses, I know that the heart of American people will respond with kindliness to suffering. Will you not take to your table an invisible guest? And so this is the famine survey that Truman asks Hoover to make. They need information about, there's only 4 countries in the world that have enough food. That's the United States, Canada, Australia, and Argentina. And there's only a few countries that are at subsistence level, and the rest are in dire straits. And so you'll see in this, they get a plane, a C-54 that's nicknamed the Faithful Cow because it makes a mooing noise when it lands. And that's their itinerary. And they go to 22 countries in 57 days, traveling 35,000 miles. They circle the globe. And that there is sunshine all throughout the trip except one day in Athens, and they've been having a drought, so that was even welcomed. And they're never late. I mean, it's just this fantastic travelogue. And you'll see, too, Hoover's getting much better with PR and that. And so the photographs that are taken of him and all of the articles being written and that. If you'll notice on this one, this little boy has a knife tucked into his belt. So it's not quite the security that we live in. But this was a very cherished photo of Hoover's work and his care for children and that. Originally, the trip was only supposed to go through Europe and that. And Hoover really felt the need that it should go on to India, to China, to Korea, and Japan. The Asian countries were at greater starvation levels, at greater risk for communism as well, and that. And so Hoover and Truman will have the less than 3-minute phone call in Cairo, Egypt. Hoover had received a telegram that he was supposed to cut the trip short and come home and talk to the American public. Truman wanted Hoover to return and promote the cause for food conservation. He was also personally a little worried about Hoover's stamina. He was, after all, a 71-year-old man, and this was a grueling schedule and that. But Hoover wanted to continue the trip through Asia. And so they talked for a little over a minute and a half, and in that time, Hoover persuaded Truman to let him continue the trip. And then one of his colleagues noted the phone rang shortly after Hoover hung up, and it was the operator saying that they had paid for a 3-minute long-distance phone call, but they liked to finish it. And Hoover said, "No, we're done." And that. So Hoover and Truman were always very practical men, even when it came to long-distance phone calls. On May 7th, 1946, this would be a day before the anniversary of VE Day, Truman would write to Hoover in that he greatly appreciated his most recent letter, and he would praise him for the work that's being done. Hoover's mission was now in Honolulu. They had circled the globe, and they were just about ready to come home and would spend VE Day at the site of Pearl Harbor and that. Truman would tell Hoover, "I fully recognize the personal sacrifice and risk which you are taking with such a hazardous journey, but the excellent results which you have obtained will be of an inestimable value to this country in assuming its responsibilities of solving the world food problems." And so the day after they get back to Washington is the meeting. And so this is the big meeting on May 13th, 1946. And it's in the Oval Office at Truman's desk again. If you're at the Truman Library, there are hundreds of photos of people seated by Truman at his desk. He loved that pose and that. And it's funny, too, you can only tell the time differences because the photos in the background will change. I don't know if it was somebody dusting and they would rearrange the family photos. But this would be Hoover's report at the end, and he would say to him, "Dear Mr. President, we have completed your instructions. We have traveled some 35,000 miles, visited 22 countries which have a deficiency of food, and informed ourselves of the situation in several others." And so this would be the letter that was attached to the final report. Truman would respond in kind, "I know the people of this country will do their part as you have done yours. We have never failed, and we will not fail now." But that wasn't enough. So Truman needed Hoover to go to South America. And so they would meet again for their fourth time on May 16th, 1946, to discuss the Russians and their sort of obstinate spirit, as Hoover would say. And Truman would ask Hoover to go to South America. And so the following day, Hoover would address and make a radio announcement. "Along the 35,000 miles we have traveled, I have seen with my own eyes the grimmest specter of famine in all the world. I was asked by the President to undertake this work in a purely advisory capacity. And with our journey now to Latin America, my service will then end." And so former President Hoover would travel from May 25th until June and would visit 11 countries in South America in those 25 days. He returns on June 19th and meets immediately with the President the following day. They discuss Argentina in particular because it does have some food resources and what to do about wheat shipments. Only like 6 months later would Hoover admit to a friend of his how exhausted he really was. And he would tell him in a letter, "Every molecule in my body yells at me that it is tired." At the end of the year in 1946, a few weeks before Christmas, Truman would send Hoover the following note. And it must have been such a wonderful gift to Hoover to finally be recognized for all of his hard work. As we've heard from the other talks before, that's all Hoover wanted to do, was to work and to serve. And Truman would write, "You don't know how greatly I appreciated your letter of the 3rd, and I think your suggestions are sound with regard to America's participation in the distribution of food. I am more than happy to have your views on any subject which you care to write me about." And Truman would state at the end, "Again, I want to say that I think you did a magnificent job last year for the welfare of the world." And those are the words that everyone loves to hear, no matter the age or experience. But we seldom say that out loud or put them to paper. I am proud of you. Thank you. And so this would be where their relationship deepened and solidified due to their common interest, respect, and trust. As we would say in contemporary circles, they had bonded. So Truman meets Hoover again the following year. It's the Germany-Austria trip in 1947. So at the end of February, there's more and more things going on in Germany. What are we going to do in the post-war era? We've got the 4 zones, and they're not cooperating well. There was a lot of question about what to do with the British zone, and that a lot of hunger. A lot of people saying, should we feed? These Nazis are just going to be at it again. And Hoover would always respond, that we must. I mean, this is the humane thing to do. In that. But he was also concerned about the economic, strategy as well. Germany is the heart of Europe, and if Germany went down, everybody else was going to go down as well. And Hoover very much knew that. and he would write about this trip to Germany and Austria, that entirely aside from any humanitarian feelings for this mass of people, if we want peace, if we want to preserve the safety and health of our army of occupation, if we want to save the expense of even larger military forces to preserve order, if we want to reduce the size and expense of our army of occupation, I can see no other course but to meet the burdens I have outlined. Our determination is to establish such a regime in Germany as will prevent forever again the rise of militarism and aggression within these people. But those who believe in vengeance and the punishment of a great mass of Germans not concerned in the Nazi conspiracy can have no misgivings for all of them. They need food and warmth and shelter. They have been sunk to the lowest level known in Western history. If Western civilization is to survive in Europe, it must also survive in Germany. And so this would be the beginning of what initially is called the Hoover Plan in March and April of 1947. We now know it as the Marshall Plan. Right? And what Hoover was recommending is that we actually spend more money than the Marshall Plan would, and that we spend this money not only in Europe, but in Asia as well. If we truly wanted to fight communism and save the taxpayers' money, we needed to do this. This was Hoover's argument in that. But both Hoover and Truman knew that their names couldn't be attached to anything. There was a Republican Congress in 1946 who was listening to Hoover but not to Truman, and there's all sorts of things going on. And so General Marshall had the status that could carry this through. And that, so these matters going on. Then we're going to have a little bit of a time that's difficult in their relationship. Other matters and issues are going to come about. The Republican Congress in the fall of 1946 has been very difficult for Truman. He needs Hoover for appropriation bills, but some would argue, did he manipulate Hoover's trust at this time? And other things. So there was a lot of contentiousness about the formation of the Marshall Plan and the role that Hoover played. So their friendship had really peaked for a while, and then it would plummet, and then it would start to go back up. Okay. And so we would see throughout the years in that this building again, Truman asks Hoover to come and kind of reformulate the government and make it much more efficient. And so that's another aspect of that. There's different social calls that they make upon each other. And then when Truman is no longer president in 1953, this is where the two men can really be as equals with each other. And so this is where their relationship can really deepen into more of a friendship. So we're going to fast forward a little bit to the dedication of the Hoover Library in August 10th of 1962. And there's all these kind of stories about Truman coming here and getting caught in the crowds, and it was such an exciting day. And Truman decided not to be too prepared, so these were extemporaneous remarks that he made to the crowd. My good friend, President Hoover, who did a job for me as President of the United States that nobody else could do, and for which I am and always will be grateful to him. I feel that I am one of his closest friends, and he is one of my closest friends, and that is the reason I am here. So I wanted to give you a little perspective on time. So this is me in early 1963, okay? As I have to remind my millennial students, it isn't really that long ago, okay? And those are my two grandfathers, so it's so nice to see Hoover's grandson here. There's just this special relationship. And though my grandfathers were very different men, I think Hoover was one of the few things they agreed on politically. So on December 19th, 1962, just 8 days before my own birth, Hoover would write from the Waldorf Astoria Towers in New York, where he lived in the penthouse. He would write to Truman about the book that Truman had written, his memoirs. And he would also, and for Hoover, this was a little bit more of a personal letter. You know, it wasn't one of his sort of engineering formulas or some of that pessimism that he's been known for in that. He really kind of opened up. And you can tell he's toward the end of his life, so he could do that. And he writes to Truman, "This is an occasion," this is 1962, "this is an occasion when I should like to add something more. Because yours has been a friendship which has reached deeper into my life than you know. I gave up a successful profession in 1914 to enter public service. I served through the First World War and after for a total of 18 years. When you came to the White House, within a month, you opened the door to me to the only profession I knew, public service, and you undid some disgraceful action that had been taken in the prior years. For all of this, and for your friendship, I am deeply grateful. Yours faithfully, Herbert Hoover." Truman would write from Independence, Missouri, a few weeks later, on January 2nd, 1963. And he still called Hoover, "Dear Mr. President, you will never know how much I appreciated your letter of December 19th, 62. In fact, I was overcome because you state the situation much better than I could. So I'll quote you. For your friendship, I am deeply grateful. Most sincerely, Harry Truman." Herbert Hoover would die shortly before noon on October 20th, 1964. Harry Truman would telegram Hoover's sons that day, expressing his deep sadness and how he wasn't able to come to the funeral due to a recent injury. Later, in June of 1965, Truman would publish this eulogy as a preface to Herbert Hoover's last book, Challenge to America, His Life and Words. And this is what Truman would say of their friendship. "My warmth and close friendship with Herbert Hoover dates back to the day he visited Washington, shortly after I succeeded to the presidency. I was moved to invite him back into public service in the hope that he might resume the task of again feeding the hungry in the wake of the frightful devastation visited on so many human beings in many parts of the world. I wanted to help restore, as quickly as possible, friend and foe alike to their normal lives and to peaceful pursuits." President Hoover did not hesitate, nor did he weigh the matter of personal convenience or even hardship. He accepted at once. The meeting between him and me at the White House is now history. His work in feeding the hungry expressed the care and generosity of all Americans, regardless of political differences. President Hoover and I have visited each other frequently, and whenever either one of us happened in the neighborhood of the other, we felt free to just drop in. President Hoover helped in the dedication in the library in Independence, Missouri, and I was glad to take part in the dedication of his library in West Branch, Iowa. Briefly put, he was my friend and I was his. In the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, Hoover and Truman both certainly held the most important attributes for both a friendship and a president. They both had a kind and understanding heart. Thank you. I think I went a little fast after lunch.
Questions?
I'm interested in your comments about
food shortage in South America. I'm certainly aware of it in Europe and the Middle East, but I was never aware that South America suffered after the war.
Well, actually, with South America, it was more of an exploration of what food they might have. So I'm kind of going through some of that quickly. But Argentina was one of the food surplus countries. But then, as we now know, and he has kind of a shaky history too, and where Nazis were fleeing and things like that, and so that part gets complicated. But it was trying to, in his engineering mind, he wanted to find out who had what, because it's the same today. We have enough food in the world, but it's the politics and the logistics and the economics of who sends what where, and so that's where Hoover's engineering mind. All of his, he was a very cosmopolitan man. He had contacts everywhere. He could talk with people, that nobody else could. And Truman certainly recognized that in him. He could go places Truman had no experience and get things done, And so that was part of the South American trip, which I haven't quite fleshed out as much as the European and Asian trip, but extremely complicated. So no matter how tired I ever get in my own travels, I just think of Hoover, like he shows up at the White House the next day. So.
Yes, thank you for your very nice contribution. One of the impressions I've had is that while Hoover and Roosevelt had a developing friendship, there was considerable opposition to that among Truman's advisors, as you mentioned in your speech. And I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit more about that, and particularly how Truman faced that down. And then secondly, you said that after peaking at a certain period, the relationship dipped. And I wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit more on that and how it revived.
Yeah. Truman had that wonderful attribute. I tell my teenager this. He was able to dance between difficult friends. Okay? So the same month that he's meeting with Truman to initiate this famine survey, March of 1946, is also the same month, as you may know, Winston Churchill is coming to Fulton, Missouri. Okay? And Hoover and Churchill had hate each other for all sorts of very good reasons they each felt. And Truman could go between them, and neither one felt threatened by that or felt that he was doing something else. So Truman had some interesting diplomatic skills with that. So, and then the second part of your question is
Yes, you said that
The dip.
the dip.
The dip and how it revived.
Yeah, it gets. So Truman makes this famine survey, comes back with extraordinary information, and they're starting to free up things. It's also working with the UN, which is a new organization, and that from his famine survey, this will be the beginning of UNICEF. Okay, and so that's directly Hoover's idea and initiation. And one of his men, Maurice Pate, who had worked with him both in the CRB and post-World War II, would then be the executive director of that. So that would be an extraordinary contribution, and that one would be pretty straightforward. The other, and this is when Truman asked him to go to Germany and Austria to assess conditions there, that's going to be more difficult. So what do we do? Do we keep feeding in a charity sort of mode, starving people, creating a dependence and an anger, possible threats to communism? So Hoover did not want that. And he was also conscious about paying, taxpayers' money and that. And so Truman really needs him to persuade this rather cantankerous Republican Congress to make these further appropriations, and they will listen, to Hoover. And so he's going to these very contentious, Senate meetings and these other hearings and making this pitch and that. But then it becomes rather partisan, and this is the part that people don't know about. So there's a Democratic committee that wants the Marshall Plan to go through, and they want to claim it. They want it as a Democrats, accomplishment. They don't want Hoover's name on it, and that. And even the former Secretary of War, Robert Patterson, Hoover, it's like one of the saddest letters I've ever seen, where he thinks Patterson has criticized, his work that he did and all of that. And Patterson's like, I didn't do this. I got caught up in a committee that's got its own agenda. I have nothing but the utmost respect for your past work and your previous work. So there's a lot of things going on with this creation of the Marshall Plan. And in many ways, and this is where you can kind of see with Truman, he is a politician. And at times you feel like he's kind of using Hoover to get what he wants, to get the Republican Senate to listen to this need for aid. And yet, is he throwing them under the bus, so to speak, at times? And so it's very difficult. It's kind of who said what, and all of that. So it's hard to piece together. But Hoover really maintains the high road, on this. And in public, he is always seen as wanting what's best, for Americans and for, as he would say, these starving children. These are children, and we can't get caught up in so much politics, that little kids are dying and that. So it's difficult. I don't have any quite clear answers.
What kind of procedure would he use when he would land in a country to determine the need? I can't imagine him traveling to that many countries. Like
Oh, I know.
every 2 days he would be in
Right.
How
Oh,
did he
it's
assess their need or their situation?
It's extraordinary. Well, first of all, they've got the infra. They've got this great plane and an Army crew and they are just top notch. Okay, so they've got the logistics. Okay, and that, and then Hoover knows he's got really good men that go with him, and he does make a deliberate decision that no women come on this trip. And I know his secretary, who was named Bunny, was a little upset about this because Bunny was the mastermind. I mean, let's face it. But the men that go with him had worked with him before. They had done famine relief. They knew people in every place that they were going. And so he had one secretary, Galpin, who was just making all of the arrangements. So every time they would land, they would have a certain routine. So they would land, somebody would meet them at the airport, there would then be an escort, they would stay, as you can imagine. This is post-World War II, okay? So things are just devastated. When they're going through Warsaw, and it's 90-some% rubble, and they're staying in one of the few buildings that's still standing, and all of this. But they would go, they would get settled, they would have several very long meetings with dignitaries. Everybody met with them, and they would have the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Food, they would have the Army, they would have some other people meeting with them, giving them the reports, okay? So that would be done. There would be some dinners, some receptions. Hoover was always good at okay, I don't want a 7-course meal when we're on a famine survey. You can't. It looks bad and that. But people were so honored to meet him. He would send Maurice Pate out in each country to make a 1 to 2 page report on the status of children. So somebody would be out visiting orphanages and schools and hospitals and things like that. And then they would get maybe 6 hours sleep, get on the plane the next morning, never had a late start, go to the next country and do it all over again. So one of his men, Frank Mason, kind of joked that we have not seen more of the world on this trip because everything was so busy and so highly coordinated. But they took great records, of everything, and then that's what they come back with this report on what should be done, about the world. So yeah, it's an extraordinary trip.
Lisa, would you talk a little bit about the topics I'm over here.
Okay.
You're disembodied.
There you are. Yeah, it's a disembodied voice. Again, the light's hitting me.
The issues that are unrelated to food relief, for example, the campaign of 1948. Did any of your research drift into that? Whether it was where Truman was it's cutting in and out. Truman was using Hoover as a political foil during the campaign. And did that affect the friendship?
A little bit, mostly I'm looking at the years of 46 and 47 really intently and that. But Truman would say some things at times and then he would sort of write it off, well, I was just being a politician or it was that, There was still a lot that Democrats could get by blaming Hoover for the Depression. That's certainly what Roosevelt had been able to do. and that. But Hoover is getting much more of a perspective at that time. He's like, well, this is politics, and you probably shouldn't have said that, but so be it. So it kind of lulls for a little bit, but Hoover himself is being asked, by the Republicans to speak at the convention, and his status is going up as well. So it's a little bit more equal in ways. They both realize they're kind of caught in scenarios, that they can't be the best at.
In my readings, I've come across the name Hugh Gibson.
Mm-hmm.
Did he accompany Hoover on the round the world trip by any chance?
He did. I think it'll make one of my best jokes. Here, I'll show you one. That's Hugh Gibson right there. And he had served with Hoover in Belgium. He was an ambassador, and that you have to laugh when you're looking back at the photos. Hugh Gibson is the biggest photo bomber there is. Okay, like Hoover meets with Hitler in 1938. There's Hugh Gibson. He meets with the Pope. There's Hugh Gibson. Every single and that. And they're two very different men. But Hugh had some of the language. He could speak French. He had a lot of the connections in that. And they truly adored each other in that. They seemed very different. And that's really something with Hoover, is that the men who serve with him, have this loyalty to him till they die. And we've often said in the archives when we're kind of talking there, like, what if you think of Hoover, but think of the radiant out, Maurice Pate and UNICEF, and Hugh Gibson, and Frank Mason starting, the records at the Hoover Institution, and it just goes on and on and on, this influence that Hoover would have, in that he and Truman were always extremely loyal to their men. They were very conscious of people who worked for them. They were very kind to people who didn't have money, and so that matters to people, so they were always willing to do anything for him. Hugh has like a really good diary of this trip. It's a bit sarcastic at points. I haven't been able to read all of it in that, so it's nice. I've got like 5 different competing diaries of the trip, and it's the secretary who's making all of the arrangements, who doesn't have any time to do anything. But yeah, they're madly typing away on the plane before the next city and talking about that. So. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the Cairo speech, and then also how involved was Truman in getting the Boulder Dam renamed Hoover?
I know, I should have the Cairo speech memorized, because that's Matt's favorite. I don't, so in Cairo, this is where he's talking. He makes several really good speeches in that. So I don't know that one as much offhand as I should in that. But Hoover becomes much better at the radio, making shorter speeches, giving kind of, interesting allusions that people can think of, So he's much better than he was as president with that. Okay. But that's only one of many of them. I think that one sort of stands out. Because they were afraid that the trip was going to be cut short, and Hoover really wanted, to go on to Asia, what was going on in India, and then you see, India's independence, shortly after, going into China, and we see what happens to China in 49. He also was very attuned to Korea and what was going to happen there, so this is all 48, 49, 50, the Korean War, okay. And then going into Japan, and then he meets with MacArthur. And it was interesting, MacArthur also calls him chief, you know. I mean, they had the utmost respect for each other. And that part, too, in China and Japan, it's the one part where he gets a little wistful about Lou. You know, he'll say, well, Mrs. Hoover, I remember this, you know, but that's the only part. And I think, too, he took this trip partly out of his grief, you know. Lou had died in 44. And this simply was a way to keep busy in the most ultimate aspect.
And the
And
renaming
Truman
of the
and the Boulder Dam.
Boulder Dam.
Oh, the Boulder Dam, yeah. So I'm not sure exactly how that got renamed, but it's just a horrible insult, you know, to go from, and I have a postcard that has, you know, Hoover Dam and then in parentheses Boulder, okay? And that, there is a wonderful little memo that Hoover writes to his friend, and he says that they should go visit the Hoover Dam now that it's renamed, you know, and just throw rocks over it, you know? And that, but I don't know if they ever did that or not. But it's a wonderful image, you know, and that because it was a petty slight, you know, and it was very public, you know, to do that to him, you know. So anyway, so I hope he threw rocks over it. Yeah, threw rocks. Rocks over Boulder Dam. Yeah, you got the pun. So it is interesting. Hoover has a pretty good sense of humor. It's just kind of understated, and it's between friends and that. So.
Just a quick note on the Boulder Dam controversy. It started out as legislation by a California congressman named Jack Anderson.
Okay.
And then it went through OMB, which approved it and was signed off on by Harry Truman to change it back to Hoover Dam. It was Harold Ickes who started calling it Boulder Dam.
Right.
But Fred Allen, who some people will remember, the great radio comedian, got on the air just after the name change was announced and said this wouldn't have been a problem if the former president had just been willing to change his name to Herbert C. Boulder.
Well, let's thank Lisa for her talk.